So, Boker Tov, everyone. If I'd had my druthers, I would have set up the room a little differently. I'd like to be among you, not in front of you, so conjure me among you. I would even move up a little bit, but I think it would mess up the videotaping. I sit here with gratitude to have the opportunity to study with colleagues and to offer a little bit of wisdom that I have gathered over my years. I'm only finishing my bar mitzvah year if some communities do bar mitzvah at 14. So if it's a delayed bar mitzvah, I'm finishing my bar mitzvah year in the rabbinate. And also, I'm sitting here with a tremendous sense of humility. I want to start from the stance that I'm not presuming that anything that I know or have learned about the challenging and holy obligation we have to be in relationship with the people that we serve is anything more wise or stellar than you have learned and taught in your own careers. But I want to share with you a bit of a shita that I have developed over time that works for me most of the time. And it's something that I remind myself of continuously, particularly as we approach the era of this year where we're going to be meeting them all again en masse, some whom we may not have seen for quite some time, some with whom we've been in an ongoing shakla v'tarya negotiation throughout the year, but all of whom, because of our position, I would say this, whether we're a pulpit rabbi or a chaplain or educator, we have taken on the commitment to engage with them in holiness, even if what they are mirroring back to us is sometimes the exact antithesis of it. And so I want to start by presuming that I know more about this than any of you do, and I'll be looking forward, if we have time, to hear some of your reactions back to me. I'm also struck by the intertextuality, the natural intertextuality that almost always happens when Jews and rabbis are coming together. In particular, I'm grateful to some of the ideas that Gordon shared before when he shared us the text that Achad Ha'am put out of the pratiyut of a prophet, the privacy, the uber privacy, which you can also understand as a bididut, a loneliness. Kitzoni, that was a word that he used not in the sense of having an extreme position, but often living on the extreme and having to operate from the extreme, even though you're constantly being asked to connect to the core, and to be mitzumtzam, right? To what extent every one of us in our lives in general, but particularly in the rabbinate, have cloaked ourselves with an intentional hitztamtsut, bringing ourselves in a little bit so that we can not only make space for the other, but enable the other to actually be overflowing their boundaries, sometimes at the cost of our feeling somewhat boxed in. So I'm going to share with you some core texts of my rabbinate. They're also core texts of my living, and I would submit to you that I'm going to speak to them specifically as they relate to our relationships with congregants, that they can speak to any level of relating that we are engaging in with loved ones, with partners, with children, with friends. But the prism today is our relationship with congregants. I noticed after the fact a shift in my own sermonizing from the Bima. The first couple of years in the pulpit, I was in a small congregation in Monroe, New York. Most of my Bima thumping and my sermonizing was about Torah and observance and trying to create a community that took the tradition more seriously than they did. I thought that was my primary role as a rabbi. I still think it's one of the primary roles of my rabbinate. But I noticed, 6 or 7 years into my rabbinate, looking back on the things that I had chosen to share, that the thrust of what I offered from the Bima had shifted from halacha to agadah, shifted from observance to midot, and that without necessarily intentionalizing it, I had become of a bit of a musser schmoozer as I spoke to the congregation. And I think it had to do with a shift that was going on internally, also not discounting the extent to which the observance of mitzvot are significant to me or to the way I practice Judaism, but wanting to at least balance it with the other truths and wisdoms that the Jewish people have given to us that we understand come from a divine origin. And so a lot of my rabbinate then, my practical rabbinate, has been impacted and is impacting that which I teach from the Bima. I'm also grateful for the frame that Gordon put up there in terms of our role as a prophet. Interestingly, again, I hadn't thought of it this way before I prepared the session. I actually think what I'm speaking to here mostly is our role as a priest, what it means when we are in the serving role, not the prophesying role, what it means when we're in the relating role and not the role where we're actually willing to threaten the relationship in order to say something of greater significance. I'm not discounting one over the other. I'm saying I'm focusing more about the priesthood. Whether you're a student or you've been a rabbi 3 times as long as I have, you know that the path we have chosen for ourselves is not an easy one. There are enormous rewards and there are challenges that no one outside of our field could possibly understand, no matter how much time it took for us to explain it to them. I think of a text that Rabbi Aaron of Zhitomir commented on the opening lines of Parshat Ki Teitze, which we'll read in a few weeks, speaking about the captive in war, V'ra'ita bashivyo eshet yifat to'ar, that when you see amongst your captives a woman who is beautiful, not going into the ethics of that text per se, his commentary on that text is that one of the challenges of being a human being, and I would say one of the challenges of being a rabbi, is to gaze upon your own captivity, so putting the shivyo, not someone you have captured, but the captivity in which you find yourselves. I'm not overusing that term, I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but there are captivities that we face every single day. What does it mean to gaze into your own captivity? The eshet yifat to'ar, and to see something of beauty, of substance, that is collectible, that is hold-onable, and that can actually nourish you even in the midst of captivity. And I believe that there are captivities in the rabbin. That's something that I teach to my interns, because I don't want them to walk into the pulpit with no one having told them how challenging some of the challenging things are, also without their knowing how beautiful some of the beautiful things are. And I also am grateful for a teaching that I learned from Rabbi Moshe Halbertal this summer when I was at Hartman. He speaks about that crazy interaction between Yoav and David after David has sent Uriah off to be killed because he lusts after Bathsheba. And when David hears the news that he knew he was going to hear, but he has to kind of feign surprise that Uriah has actually been killed, the words that he says in the 11th chapter, Shmuel Bet, is Kazeh v'kazeh tochal hacherev. Right? This way and that way, the sword swallows, the sword consumes. Halbertal was using it as a way of saying that our own contributions to the violence of our relationships can be indiscriminate. The small ways in which we unsheath our blades, which we all have, can hit the defenseless when we're not aware, and that can redound back to us. Kazeh v'kazeh tochal hacherev. Once the blade has been unsheathed, it's sometimes not possible to know how much injury can take place, which is why, of course, there needed to be blood over the doorpost anyway, because once the Malach HaMavet was released, once the Mashchit was out there, not even God's power could rein it in. It needed to have some physical blocker to getting into those doors. Another way of saying this is depressing on some level or completely liberating, is that the only thing that we control in most of our relationships with most of the people we encounter most of the time, the only thing we control is ourselves, our words, our intentions, our motivations. We cannot take responsibility necessarily for their reactions to us. We cannot take responsibility for any lack of health, relational health, maybe bringing into that moment, but we can and absolutely must control what we are submitting into that moment so that we are really aware when the cherev is unsheathed. We're going to look at text in a second, but I want to start with a story of Maseh Shehaya. I'm not embellishing this. I was walking across La Cienega Boulevard about 3 months ago. Our synagogue's at the corner of La Cienega and Olympic. It's a busy street. I was with my 3 children, my 12-year-old, my 10-year-old, and my 2-year-old. And at that moment, the only thing that I was focusing on was their not being killed by a car. It's a very dangerous intersection. Literally, nothing else could possibly have intruded upon my consciousness. And as we're walking across the street, and I have my hand on my toddler, and my 10-year-old is, perhaps veering out of the walkway, a congregant came over to me and said, sorry, this was 6 months ago, and said, you know what, I told the story wrong. I have to backtrack, I apologize. 3 months ago, the following thing happened in Daily Minyan. Forget that I told you about the crosswalk, I'll come back to it. I'm wrapping up my tefillin in Daily Minyan, and a congregant came over to me in that way that made it very clear that he wanted a lot of my attention. So I'm unwrapping my attention, and he said, this congregant whose wife's parent had died that week, and the funeral had been early in the week, and the first shiva had been last night. He said to me, Rabbi Kligfeld, good morning. Good morning. He said, when her mother died, you noticed that we didn't call you to do the funeral. I said, okay. He said, that was not an accident. I said, and last night you were at our home the first night of Shiva. You may have noticed that, you may have felt a little bit of coolness from us as you were conducting the Shiva. I said, okay, well, tell me what's on your mind. Because that too was not an accident, Rabbi. So here we go, right? I can feel like the contours of my heart stiffening. I can imagine the defense I'm going to eventually have to put out there for whatever offense I am about to be accused of. And I said, would you like to tell me what's on your mind? He said, 6 months ago we were crossing La Cienega, back to La Cienega. And my wife told you that her mother had a stroke and that she was in a nursing home. And that she wanted you to be aware of it. I said, okay. And from that day forward, we didn't hear from you once. You never asked once how she was doing. You never once offered to visit. You never once checked in. It's as if it never happened, Rabbi. So when she died, we called another rabbi to do the funeral. And when it came time for Shiva, we brought you into our home, but you weren't really that welcome. Oh my God. So don't raise your hand, but raise an internal hand in your heart. If you've ever had an experience where not only are you being accused of something that would have been really painful if you had done it intentionally, but it's actually being accused of something in the realm of your own personal and rabbinic ethics that you're actually proud of for doing particularly well and paying zealous attention to it, and so blindly out of context to what you, the rabbi, may have been experiencing at the original moment of offense. And I was thinking back to that moment when this woman had told me apparently that her mother had a stroke, and thinking that my consciousness in that moment was only focused on making sure that my children did not die as they crossed a busy intersection. And that was the moment I was expected to be present for another, hold on to her pain, remember it, of course, after Shabbat. I don't write on Shabbat, and then find ample opportunities to check in. That's part one of the story, and I'm going to resolve the story after we look at some texts. But just hold on to that tension, and hold on to the rising and growing bile in your kishkas, so you can identify with what was churning inside of me, and what I wanted to say, what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to scream, what I wanted to geshrai, and any other career I wanted to have besides being a pulpit rabbi. Look at the first side of the sheet, Masechet Sukkah. In the interest of time, to a fewer minutes than I thought we were going to have, I'm going to read through this text rather than do a kind of active chabruta. This is a page of Sukkah which is responding to the question how we know that the Anuim, that the movement of the Lulav is as it is. And so the Gemara says, Tanan Hatam, we learn elsewhere in a Mishnah in Masechet Menachot, chapter 5, Mishnah 6, Shtei halechem u'shnei kivsei atzeret ketzad hu oseh, regarding other things that are moved, having nothing to do with Sukkot. The two shewbreads, right? That's how they're always translated. And the two sheep, or what's a keves? What's a better word? Sheep, right? Lambs, thank you. Lambs of the Shavuot holiday, which were also kind of waved. These are actually not just the daily shewbreads, but particular breads that were brought out on Shavuot. How would you do it? Meiniach shtei halechem al gabei shnei hakvasin. You take the two breads and you put them on top of the sheep. Umeiniach yado tachtehen umeinif. and you put your hand underneath them and you wave, molich umevi. You kind of bring them out and you bring them in. Some people are actually very punctilious when it comes to waving the lulav, that you're not just shaking the lulav, you're actually going in, out, in, out. That a nuah is not a this, but a this, right? Maleh umorid, that you raise them and that you lower them. Shene Amar, in the 29th chapter of Shemot, Asher Hunaf, Asher Huram, a verse taken outside of the context of either of these sacrifices, but a way of referring to the fact that these are sacrifices which are waved and which are raised. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, asking the question why. Molich umevi, when you bring them out and then you bring them back to yourself. Lemi sheha'arba ruchot shalo. You're doing it to kind of show or delineate the one who all of the directions belong to, that one, God. Ma'aleh umorid, you bring up and you bring down, lemi shehamayim v'ha'aretz shalo, to the one to whom belongs the heavens and the earth. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, the primary reason that we are waving these sacrifices, and later on, as we said, same thing with lulav, is what? What's the primary reason for the waving? Indicating what? Indicating that God is everywhere, right? You are noting your faith that God is omnipresent. Okay. The Ma'arava matnuhache. In the West, when this very idea was taught in the land of Israel, they gave a different explanation. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Ukva mar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, molich umevi. You bring it out and you bring it back, kedei la'atzor ruchot ra'ot, in order to interrupt negative winds or negative spirits. Not clear which one he means here. Maleh umorid. You bring it up and you bring it down. Kedei la'atzor tzlalim ra'im. So you can interrupt the bad dews. I didn't really encounter a bad dew. Dew is usually a pretty good thing. But apparently there's some bad dews out there. And by waving bread and lambs and palm fronds, you can interrupt them. Okay? Amar Yossi bar Avin, v'item Rabbi Yossi bar Zvela, zot omeret shayrei mitzvah makvin et hapuranot. What you're telling us is that not only the mitzvah, but the shayrei mitzvah. What would be a preferred translation of shayrei mitzvah? I translate as the remnants, the small pieces, the things that if you were at a Hasidic tish and you got a tiny morsel of bread that the Rebbe had eaten, right? But that's the way we're thinking of it here. Even the tiny pieces that fall off of the main mitzvah, they can interrupt, can get in the way of disaster. Sharei tznufa, sharei mitzvah here. We can not possibly claim that the waving of these things is the observance of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is holding them. The mitzvah is presenting them. At the most, they're sharei mitzvah. They're the absolute remnants of the edges, the fringes, as it were, the tzitzit of the mitzvah. But tzitzit as tafel, not tzitzit as ikar. Ve'otzer ruchot tzlalim ra'im. And nevertheless, they stop the winds, the bad winds, and the bad dews. One last little phrase, and then I'll tell you what I'm pulling out of this text. It has nothing to do with sukkah in my mind. Well, it does, but not what I'm using it for. V'amar Rabbi v'chein lulav. The same thing with lulav. The same thing we can understand in terms of why we shake lulav. Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov mamtele umaitele. Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov would indeed bring it out and bring it back in. Amar, dain gira be'ene desitna. But then he said to himself after doing it, or while he was doing it, this should be a poke in Satan's eye. I'm not doing it to delineate where God is. I'm not doing it to invite a magical interruption of negativity. I'm doing it to poke Satan. What happens when you poke Satan? The Gemara tells us, v'lav miltahi. It's not a worthy thing to do. Don't be so proud of yourself for having poked someone who might be full of evil, or in the Nimshal, full of non-understanding, or full of impatience, or full of overblown expectations. Mishum da'ate li'igrarure be. Because it could provoke him. And when you provoke Satan, it doesn't always end well. 3 things I pull out of this text. Number 1, the shayrei mitzvah, that the small things matter. You could go crazy with this thought because we cannot possibly keep track of not only all the small things that exist in relationship, but certainly can't keep track of the small things that exist, that are said or not said, that you're going to be held accountable for. But this notion, latov and laira, to build, livnot ulaharos, somehow it's not just in the ritual sphere that the mitzvah itself is effecting change, but somehow the minimal extensions or outgrowths or tzitziot of the encounters make a difference in our relationships that we are trying to build. That is an important thing that I keep to myself, that I keep reminding myself of all the time. Number 2, this machloket between Babylonian and Eretz Israel as to what we're doing when we're shaking lulav. Shaking lulav is a really strange thing, right? Can we just name it that? I'm committed to it, but it's a strange thing. I had a woman in my congregation in New York who, we didn't have a daily minyan in our shul, but we had a Sunday minyan and we had a Rosh Chodesh minyan, we had a Chol HaMoed minyan. And she was one of those daily minyan, regular minyan makers. She wasn't a particularly observant person, but she liked coming to minyan. And when it came time to the Hoshanot on Sukkot, she always volunteered to hold the Torah as we were making our perambulations around the congregation. I once asked her, Doris, her name was Doris, you're such a devoted member of this congregation. I know you take, all this stuff seriously. Do you want one time to give the holding of the Torah to someone else, and you can walk around with a lulav, which is the central idea of this mitzvah, of this ritual? And she said, Rabbi Klikfeld, don't take this the wrong way. I buy kosher food, and I come to shul on Shabbat, and I do many of the rituals of Judaism, and I like holding a Torah, but I don't wave fruit. Right? So that's where I draw the line. I don't wave fruit. I can't wave fruit and feel like it's a Jewy thing. And you know what? I do wave fruit, but I understand her reticence towards it. In this machloket between Babylonia and Eretz Israel, so why we do it. On the one hand, we have this notion of God's omnipresence. God is everywhere, which means let's just say the obvious. If God is everywhere, and God is being God everywhere, then there's no moment where we shouldn't be able to expect that God is there being God, even if God is walking across a busy street with his children. What the Jews of Eretz Israel are saying, you misunderstand the ritual. It's not just that we're pointing out perhaps an obvious thing that God is everywhere. This is what we might call an apotropaic ritual. The ritual is actually effecting change in the ether of the world. I can stop negative winds, I can stop negative dews simply by performing this ritual, which is to suggest there is some magical quality to the religious life that we're investing in, and by extension, there may be some magical quality to the person that I am committed to relying on as representing that very tradition. I would suggest to you that what the Jews of Bavel and the Jews of Israel are arguing about regarding lulav could also be an argument without victor, an argument without resolution, an argument that ends in teku regarding Jews and congregants' reactions to, expectations of, and relating to their rabbis. Either we are everywhere, and so when we're not everywhere, or we're not there when we're there, to quote what someone said that about Oakland, is there. It's not only is the rabbi there, but is the rabbi there when the rabbi is there? Or there is an expectation, even as they are perfectly comfortable at Paul pointing out our fallibilities, when our fallibilities work into their narratives of what is real, there's also a very convenient whipping out and wielding of our supposed infallibilities, because we are magic makers, and we can heal the sick, and we can remember 100 things on Shabbat, and we can be the difference between 6 months of a woman's pain about her mother dying and what? Her not being in pain about her mother dying? I want to soften my tone of voice. I take these expectations of me, of us, seriously and with a sense of blessing. But when it comes up against the enormous expectations that we can't possibly fulfill, there can be a moment of conflict. And when you think you have the perfect retort to the congregant or to Satan, watch where you point that lulav. Flip the page. I believe in mnemonics, not just I. Mnemonics help us remember things. They organize. The rabbis believe in them as well. And I have come up with a mnemonic that helps me, and I think about it in real time in these very moments. And I thought about it that moment at Daily Minyan as I was being accused of being an insensitive and not listening and forgetful rabbi who doesn't care at all about taking care of his congregants. Here are the 4 C's, or the holy C's, pun intended, because we should not confuse ourselves with the Pope. We're not papal, even if there are holy See-like papal expectations of us. What I want to say as I go through these is that it's really hard. You all know it. There's nothing that I'm sharing with you that you may not know. I'm offering you a different frame. It's hard for me, even though I have thought of this, I've written about it, I've taught it. It's really hard in the moment as you feel yourself being accused of something that you know is so far away from your core values. Right? What does it mean to center yourself as another C and get into these 4 C's? Here's what I tell you. Here's my parish. Here's my Rashi on my own text of the 4 C's. Concern. I'm standing there at Daily Minyan. I have been totally blindsided by this accusation of my core rabbinic principle. And my first reaction was, of course, to defend myself and to explain why everything that he is saying about me and my behavior is a misreading of who I am. I tamped it down. The first thing I did was, in a way that could not be possibly misunderstood, was to express concern. Right? What does it mean when someone attacks you? They're actually hoping a little bit for a fight, because they've already actually developed in their own mind their retort to your retort. They've anticipated your defense, and they have come up with a second round already. And how disarming it is in that moment when they might expect you to raise your shoulders and to, if not to poke Satan, at least put up a wall against Satan, show true and unalloyed and uncynical and unangry and untormented concern. To express concern for the other. The other in that moment, this congregant who was very upset with me, what he was going through was real for him. And what his wife was going through was real for her, even though I thought their expectations were outrageous. They didn't think they were outrageous. And the first thing I did was express ample and abundant and possibly even overcompensatory concern. The second C is curiosity. Do you know how strange, how in a lovely way, how strange it is when you express a critique or a disappointment, and because you actually feel that the disappointment or the critique might be overly heavy, you're actually possibly afraid the person's going to take it the wrong way and get very defensive. And what does it mean when that person actually, instead of getting defensive, says, "Please tell me more. I'm curious about your experience." But mean it. Even if you don't really feel like you mean it. But I meant it. Right? I was steaming inside. I was so angry that this person didn't recognize that I was distracted by the most important thing of all, which was not having a toddler be run over by a car. But I said to this congregant, I want to know more about what happened that day. And I want to know more about what your wife has experienced. I feel like, can you fill out the contours of your disappointment? I am curious. He had no idea what to do with that because he wasn't expecting that. It was a reverse of the magical understanding of ritual, right? He was trying to call me on my not having been magically there for them. And the first thing I did, or the second thing I did, was ask for more information so that the magical process of people who are very far away getting closer together could begin. I started with concern, I went to curiosity. Contrition. I believe strongly, I've learned this from one of my teachers, Rabbi Terry Bookman. I don't know if you know the name. He's a Reform Rabbi of Miami. He's a very important teacher of mine. And he has this couplet of an idea, which I live by. And it may seem obvious, but roll it around in your head after the shiur. Apologize for everything that you can and nothing that you can't. When a volley of arrows is being slung your way by a congregant or someone else, and of the 33 that come over, 2 of them land as something that you feel bad for, but 31 of them are outrageous. Your obligation as a Jew and as a rabbi is to fully own the pieces that you resonate with, even if the rest of it you consider to be nourishkeit, and to express contrition and apology and sorrow in the fullest of terms without any half-speaking for them. And, equally so, never apologize for something that you're not sorry for. It dilutes the notion of an apology, and they'll figure it out over time. It will render you someone whom you're not, and it will make you angry for having to grovel for something that you're not sorry for. You can go back to concern. I go back to concern. If there's something that they're angry at that I'm really not sorry for, I can express concern for their emotions, and I can mirror their emotions. But I refuse to apologize for something that I don't think that I did wrong. But I apologize abundantly for everything that I did. And if the first 3 C's work, and if you see a softening, and you see a closing, a approaching, after concern has been expressed, after curiosity has been exhibited, and after contrition has been really achieved, then maybe, and it doesn't work in every situation, I find that if I try to push for before it's due, or push for in a situation in which it wasn't called for, the whole thing collapses. Sometimes you have an opportunity to clarify the situation, to name what you thought was a misperception on their part, when you think that by their continuing to work off of that misapprehension, not only will your relationship with them be in trouble, but they might continue to speak or talk or share a narrative that you know is really untrue. In this particular situation, I think that I did the first 3 C's well enough that I saw opportunity for clarity. In this conversation at Shiva, I said to this gentleman whose wife was still sitting Shiva, is your wife expecting any visitors this morning? If not, I'd like to go visit. He said, no. I finished wrapping up my tefillin. I had many appointments this morning, as we all do in the morning, and I canceled them, and I went over to her house, and I sat with her in her Shiva home to try to turn around this. These are dear members a long time. I care for them. I do. I'm in a sacred relationship with them, even though their expectations were outsized. And I sat with her, and I amply did the first 3 C's, and I knew that we were in a different place. I knew that she was experiencing me differently. She was still angry. She had a right to be angry. I did say to her without any sense that I was overstating it, you needed your rabbi in the last 6 months. Your mother was sick, and she was dying. You needed me to know. You needed me to check in, and I didn't. And I'm sorry. And I was really sorry. Why I didn't know, that could only come in the clarity. And here's how I handled the clarity. And I wouldn't have handled it this way if I didn't think there was an opening. I said to her, I want you to understand the sin I committed and the sin I didn't commit, because they're important. I said, you think that the sin I committed was hearing of your pain and your vulnerability and callously not responding for the last 6 months. That would have been a grievous sin for which your anger at this level would have been fully proper. I didn't commit that sin. The sin I committed was being focused on my children in the moment you were telling me something important, it not registering in my Shabbat mind. The sin I committed was not asking you in the moment, having the presence of mind as we're crossing La Cienega, can you please, after Shabbat, which I try to do all the time on Shabbat, send me an email or send me a text just to remind me of the conversation before it recedes into the ether of my consciousness. My sin was not taking that step. But when your husband came to me this morning at Minyan and told me about the situation, he was not reminding me of something that I'd forgotten, or reminding me of something that was there. It was as if he was telling me for the first time. I did not know. I was not there for you the last 6 months. You needed me. You deserved me. Everything you've done as a congregation in this congregation has deserved that. I wasn't there. But I want you to know why I wasn't there. It worked. It's possible it couldn't have worked. It's possible that my attempt at the final C could have been interpreted as a poking of Satan. But I think that when the first 3 C's are done without any cynicism, you have a chance at the 4th. Now, there has to be, for me, I keep saying the first person because everyone's going to work in a different way, there has to be some proactive humility in this process. One of my favorite texts that I learn over and over again that I teach as often as I can, is from the Noam Elimelech, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk. Before his commentary on the Torah, he has a series of kind of almost like 12-step articulations of how to be in the world. So, Hanhagot Ha'olam, right, the behaviors of a human being. And in the 12th paragraph, look what he says, and I love this. Lo yatil ema yetera betoch beito. Lahatil is an interesting verb here. You should not lay or impose or somehow expect or accept too much ema, too much fear, too much trembling in your home. What's that? He's got a footnote better. Thank you. V'lo yakpid shum hakpada betoch beito. Is this entire paragraph Rambam?
I don't know yet.
All right. So Moshe ben Maimon, I thank you for whatever part of this is yours. And you should not. I never know how to translate yakpid. You should not be too strict about it. You should not be a kapdan, whatever a kapdan is. You should not. You shouldn't be too. Right? Regarding any sort of hakpata in your own home. V'im yelo shum hakpada, if you have this tightening of your spirit or tightening of your heart towards a child, a spouse, a congregant, al davar echad, or on some matter, if you feel yourself stiffening, how many times a day do we feel ourselves stiffening? And sometimes I think of myself, I'm only doing myself harm when I feel myself stiffen. The lining of my heart is coarsening, but sometimes you can't control it. Yizkor miyad chata'at urav. Think immediately to the sins of your youth. This is not, I think, an overly self-flagellation. I'm worth nothing. Everything that happens in the world is my own fault. I don't think what he's going for here. It's trying to identify with a humility that can be effective in managing relationship. Remember the sin of your own youth before you were the mature and complete and sophisticated and balanced person that you are right now. V'yomar b'libo, and say inside of your own heart, Ein zeh ki im avonotai heviuni lideh hakpadazo. There's got to be something that in my own narrative, has to take responsibility for this moment. It's not that I'm at fault here, but there's something happening inside my own system, something that I once did or never resolved, that is leading to some of the intensity of the conflagration and is bringing me to this moment. It can't be all their fault all the time. It can't be, even when it's clear that it is. And there, with regard to everything like this that happens, you remember your sins, and through that, your Yetzer Hara, the strength of your Yetzer Hara is subdued and it is broken. In this moment I had with this congregant, which is just an iconic moment that could have happened to all of us, I really don't believe there was anything that I could have done different in the moment, aside from reminding them to remind me after Shabbat to kind of prevent what happened. But as I was feeling myself tightening in daily minyan, I went to that place of, I am not a perfect human being. I am not a perfect rabbi. I have been disappointed. Lower the volume. Unstiffen your shoulders. Be vulnerable. Be human. Be humble. It works. Fourth text, and then I'm going to finish with the last story. We only have 3 minutes left, and these texts deserve much more time than we're giving them. I apologize. This is a phenomenal text from Masechet Shabbat. Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rabbi Shua ben Levi said, "My dichtiv, what is the meaning of this verse from Shir HaShirim, from the first chapter of Shir HaShirim? Tzror hamor dodili bein shadai yalin. That my lover is to me a sachet of myrrh. Myrrh here being the spice myrrh, right? Resting between my breasts." What does that verse mean? According to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, this is one of these texts that, what does the Talmud say? Had God not actually said it, we couldn't have said it. Had the text not said it, we couldn't have said it, because it's such an outrageous theology, but wonderful at the same time. Amra Knesset Yisrael lifnei hakpa, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. The Knesset Yisrael, the people of Israel, said in front of the Ribono Shel Olam, Ribono Shel Olam, af al pi shemeitzar umeimar li. It's a play on Tzror Hamor. Don't read Tzror as a sachet, a collection. Don't read Hamor as myrrh. But Tzror as Meitzar, Tsuris. Hamor as Mar, bitter. Even though you, God, are embittering to me sometimes. You are a pain in the tuchus, Kadosh Baruch Hu. And even though sometimes You are a source of tremendous tzuras to me. Dodi ben Shaddai Yalin. I clutch, you would expect the opposite. This is not the Shekhinah saying to us. This is us saying it to the Shekhinah. I clutch you between my bosom and I hold you. Because I do not assume a fairness in this relationship. I do not assume that you are always going to treat me the way I deserve to be treated. But I do obligate myself for the sake of myself and for you to act back in the relationship the way I think my values demand that I do. What does it mean? And I'm not suggesting you take this to the extreme of the victim syndrome and to not cry out when you're being abused. Sometimes rabbis are abused, and we need protection from one another in those moments. I'm not talking about abuse, but I do think that rabbis have to love when being beaten. I think that we have to be able to say, whether we're the God or the Knesset Israel in the situation, I'm sticking with you. I'm sticking with this, even though it is hard. And even though in this moment, you're not treating me so well, I'm not even going to tell you how not well you're treating me. Last story as a way of bringing this into something that can work not only in a relationship with our congregants, but with any people in a relationship with. One of the most painful periods of my life were the days leading up to my wedding. Al Ken Yazov Aviv Ish et Aviv et Imo Devak Bishto. I'm sure we all darshan this, that in order to glue to your partner, there is a rupture, Yazov, it's not Yetzei. There is an Aziva that happens from your parents in order to glue to your partner. I have a wonderful relationship with my parents, always have. Not perfect, but not one that was overly tense and fraught. And Vesuvius began to erupt emotionally somehow in the week before my wedding. I don't know, still to this day I don't know why, particularly between me and my mother. My mother is a very committed and wonderful and beautiful mother. She's also one of the more stubborn people on the planet and a very hard emotional book to crack. And something was wrong. I don't know what it was. She didn't know what it was. Sometimes you just see the symptoms. You have no idea what's the original infection. I got married on a Thursday in Los Angeles, living in Connecticut at the time. My Ufruf was Monday morning at my home synagogue. It was a disaster of an Ufruf. I wish I could relive it. I always thought I would have a great Ufruf. I don't know, I just figured I would. It was a disaster. I was 27 years old. I know exactly what time to set the alarm clock in order to get to someplace on time, and yet that Monday morning, my mother came into my room, 5 minutes and then 10 minutes and 15 minutes as if I was still in 6th grade, and she was telling me what time she was schlepping me out of bed almost physically. I couldn't look at her at the Ufruf, which is terrible. This is happening to me. I'm not the groom who was going to have this kind of a situation with his mother at his wedding. I didn't believe it. And then on that very day, she was driving me from my home in Connecticut to Bradley Airport near Hartford, and I was flying to LA, and I was going to be spending the last couple of days with some dear friends of mine, some colleagues to be, and the next time I was going to see my mother was the Bedeket. And we're driving on the Merritt Parkway up 91 to the airport in silence. It was intolerable. I remember thinking, I'm furious at her. You're the adult in the situation. How dare you lahatil eima, to allow eima and hakpada to be sovereign at this moment. I was so angry at her for not being more open, for not giving me some of the space to just be a groom. I was furious. But the minutes were ticking by, and we were moving north, and pretty soon she was going to be dropping me off at the airport. The next time I was going to see my mother was going to be at my wedding, and I couldn't believe this was happening to me. And she wasn't going to go first. I knew it. And somewhere about 20 minutes before we get to the airport, we had not said a word the entire trip. I turned to my mother and I said, Ima, I'm scared. Scared to get married. I don't really know what it means. I'm scared for this next stage. And I need you. And that did it. And for 20 minutes, mother and son found one another. And a relationship that had been over there got close. And hakpada turned into ahava. And vulnerability was the plank across which a relationship got to be reignited. And we didn't even have to go down to the tohu and vohu that was informing that moment. We simply had to find a heart-to-heart connection, and we could build on top of that. I don't know where it came from within me to approach it that way, but it did, and I'm grateful that it did, because I got to be with my parents the way I expected to be at my chuppah and build on top of that since then. Again, not perfectly, but warmly and beautifully. And I have tried to bring in my relationship with my parents and my wife and my children, even and especially when they're toddlers, and my congregants, even and especially when they act like toddlers, to start with vulnerability, to rely on humanity to rule and to work, to only go for clarity when I really see the opening, to remember my own contributions to difficult moments, and to try to build sanctity when it seems the least possible thing that is there. And so as we go into this season and are confronted with the enormity of the people that we serve, I invite you to walk in with the holy seas and an open heart and a loving expectation, an unwillingness to be trampled upon, but a willingness to be the one that says first, I'm sorry, and I love, and I clutch you to me.